truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Friday, September 20th, 2024, the 1,339th day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening through a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can become a paid subscriber for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month. And in doing so, you will get the ad-free experience. You'll be able to participate in the conversation over on Substack, and you'll be invited to the interactive live stream every Wednesday afternoon. And if you can't or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the free version on Substack, a wide variety of podcast platforms, and of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin. And you feel better about precious metals? I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company. And that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. All right, so I said yesterday we were going to get to some geopolitics today, and we are. But before that, just a couple quick updates about some things that we've been discussing this week. So let's head on over to CNN. The headline late this morning, Johnson said he believes Trump understands House GOP doesn't have the votes to pass the SAVE Act. House Speaker Mike Johnson believes President Trump understands that House Republicans do not have the votes to pass the SAVE Act, following a private meeting between the two men on Thursday night. Now, first off, I love that CNN is back to just calling Donald Trump president. I mean, they mess it up a paragraph later, so whatever. But that little slip up seems to be happening a lot lately. And while we're on the subject, this was Meryl Streep last night zooming in for a little event with Kamala Harris and Oprah Winfrey, where they had all sorts of virtual guests at the event. Some normal Americans and some celebrities, but it's got to make Kamala feel like she's popular all over the country when, of course, she isn't. This is Meryl Streep acting.
Hello, President Harris. Oh.
Yeah.
47 days.
47 days, yes.
From my mouth to God's ear. And hello, Oprah.
Oh, hello, President Harris. Oh, ha 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 ha. I meant something else. That was a slip up, you see. I know you're not the president. These people are so embarrassing. They think no one can see it. Meryl Streep is widely considered one of the best actresses in Hollywood, which works in a film where you're already aware the people are acting. It doesn't work in real life when you're supposed to be authentically representing yourself and you come off inauthentic. And I know literally thousands of actors, some of them very, very talented. That does not make them good liars. In fact, they're often especially bad liars because it is obvious that they're acting if you know how they are the rest of the time in normal life. So we have Meryl Streep with a fake slip up pretending that Kamala Harris is the real president. And we have CNN with a real slip up accidentally being right about who's president. Nice going, CNN. Publicly, the former president has called on Republicans to shut down the government if they could not attach the controversial measure targeting non-citizen voting to government funding. Look, President Trump fully understands the situation. He understands our margins, and he's frustrated, as I am, that we couldn't get that done in the original play. But we go back to the playbook. We'll have a plan B. We're having thoughtful conversations developing that. I'm sure it will come together over the weekend. And this is Mike Johnson speaking. The SAVE Act is a GOP-led bill that passed the House on a standalone basis in July and would require documentary proof of U.S. citizenship to register to vote in federal elections, despite the fact that it is already illegal for non-citizens to vote in federal elections. The House failed on Wednesday to pass a 6-month GOP government funding plan that included the controversial measure. Now, they always say it's already illegal for non-citizens to vote, but non-citizens do vote. A lot of non-citizens vote. I wouldn't be remotely surprised if it was millions of non-citizens having their votes cast for them. And that is the more accurate way to talk about it. It's not that the non-citizens are going down to the polling place and casting their vote in person themselves or anything. And they're probably not filling out mail-in ballots. They just have voter registries, and the uniparty's election fraud process takes care of producing the ballot, marking the vote, entering that ballot into the count, and then defending all votes as valid. All they need is the voter registrations from the illegal aliens. Asked specifically if Trump wants Johnson to shut the government down over this issue, Johnson said, "Look, President Trump understands our dilemma. He wants election security, as I do. We're going to use every opportunity, every measure, every platform we have to press that." Separately, Johnson said he has spent a lot of time with Trump. Now, that was a very tight answer by Johnson. CNN asked if Trump wants Johnson to shut the government down over this issue. And Johnson did not answer that question. That question is specifically meant to reroute the issue. This keeps the issue about election security and about whether or not illegal aliens are allowed to vote in our elections. If Johnson had answered about what Trump wants relative to the government shutdown, then that answer would have become the new issue. If he says, yes, Trump wants the government shut down if this doesn't get passed, then it's Trump responsible for government shutdown? And if he says no, Trump doesn't want the government to shut down, even if it means that the SAVE Act gets left behind, then any leverage to get the SAVE Act included is immediately gone. Any answer to that question eliminates the leverage, which is why the media, in its capacity as an arm of the uniparty, is asking that question. They want to divert the issue to Trump and to government shutdown as some dramatic issue that it just isn't. That's one of those issues that's supposed to sound scary, but it's going to be just fine. If the federal government simply shut down forever, everything would soon be just fine. And people are like, what? How could that be so? Well, you have an overtly hostile government right now that is empowered to continue being hostile. Having no federal government is better than that. We still have state governments, which is where things ultimately must be fixed anyway. That's what local action, national impact means. We are in a process of decentralization. Rather than top down from the federal government, it is bottom up from all of the people, which means we get ourselves in order, we get our house in order, we get our family in order, we get our friend group or our co-workers in order, your town, your city, your country. You go up from the bottom rather than down from the top. Now, you're not going to be able to affect all those levels without some considerable power being built along the way, but that's the proper direction of things, which is why the uniparty regime, the media, that whole system continually tries to focus our attention on the biggest possible bodies. We hear about what our role needs to be in a global sense, our role in the world. Forget about your role for yourself, taking care of your mental health, your emotional health, your physical health, working hard, supporting those around you. Forget about any of that. You need to do what the WHO says. The uniparty needs to avoid a government shutdown. We don't need to avoid a government shutdown. We can welcome a government shutdown. That means the threat of that event occurring only affects one side in this calculus. All the leverage relative to the government shutdown is on our side. They can't threaten us and say, you know what's going to happen to you if the government shuts down? Yeah, commie, nothing. In fact, I'm pretty sure things might improve. So sorry, that threat doesn't work. And I also want to update on this. This is the New York Times today. Georgia Election Board orders hand counting of ballots. Now, this was met with much celebration. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but this is one of those stories where the headline is meant to provoke a certain emotion that is not justified by what is actually going on. The Georgia State Election Board voted on Friday to force counties to hand count all ballots cast on Election Day, a move critics say could significantly delay the reporting of results in the battleground state and inject chaos into the post-election period. The new rule, which passed on a 3-2 vote, runs counter to extensive legal advice from the top election official and law enforcement officials in the state. A nonpartisan collective of local election officials had also objected to the change. Now, none of that matters at all. The New York Times is telling you about what some people think. The new rule is the latest in a stream of right-wing election policies passed by the State Election Board over the past few months. The board has come under increasing pressure from critics already concerned that it has been rewriting the rules of the game in a key swing state to favor former President Donald J. Trump. Last month, the board granted local officials new power over certifying the election, which opponents say could potentially disrupt the process if Mr. Trump loses in November. And again, a total canard. The situation prior was that those officials just acted as a rubber stamp and had to approve as verified whatever results were spit out. This is the sort of issue that arose often in 2020. They're not doing this to benefit Trump, though it might benefit Trump by eliminating fraud. But that's not the reason to do this. The reason to do this is because the verification and certification process shouldn't simply be a series of rubber stamps. And that's what it is. When the news tells us that these elections have been certified, the election officials all did their jobs, the American people do not understand, by and large, that what these officials do is simply rubber stamp something and pass it along so that all of them have, quote unquote, done their job, which requires no actual oversight and provides the upside of diluting accountability among all of them. None of them are accountable for any of this if all they are is a rubber stamp. This is pure systemic corruption. The new rule to require hand counting in addition to a machine count, critics argue, could introduce errors and confusion into the process and potentially disrupt the custody of ballots. Well, we found out in 2020 in places like Arizona, there's already no chain of custody for the ballots. Anyone who understands anything about the election process believes that hand counting of ballots is a necessity across the board. So the idea that that is somehow problematic, but the machines known to create the opportunity for fraud and manipulation are not the problem. To start hand counting on election night, poll workers would likely have to break open the seals on boxes of completed ballots, possibly exposing the ballots to fraud or loss. In previous elections, ballots remained sealed and stored securely unless a recount was ordered. Yes, they are stored so securely that no one can see them ever, even when courts order it. The hand counting rule was among nearly a dozen election changes under consideration on Friday. The proposals included a variety of conservative policy goals, like expanding access for partisan poll watchers. The proposals come just 46 days before the election, after poll workers have been trained and ballots have been mailed to overseas voters. Oh no! On Thursday, the Attorney General's office took the rare step of weighing in on the proposed rules, saying they, quote, very likely exceed the board's statutory authority, end quote. Elizabeth Young, a senior assistant attorney general, characterized 5 specific proposals as either exceeding the board's legal reach or as an unnecessary redundancy, including the hand count proposal. There are thus no provisions in the statutes cited in support of these proposed rules that permit counting the number of ballots by hand at the precinct level prior to delivery to the election superintendent for tabulation, Ms. Young wrote in a letter, which was reviewed by the New York Times. Accordingly, these proposed rules are not tethered to any statute and are therefore likely the precise type of impermissible legislation that agencies cannot do. And here's where the bad news comes in. The bad news is that they're probably right, and that it probably should be that way, and that the courts will probably decide in that direction. We've seen a number of decisions over the last couple years by the Supreme Court that reduce the power of the agencies within the federal bureaucracy and make it clear that they are not empowered to create rules and statutes and laws without the specific delegation of that power by Congress, by the legislature. Now, I don't pretend to know all of the specifics here in Georgia, but in a principles-based approach, that same principle applied here says that their critique is correct and that the agency does not have this power. The state legislature is responsible for the election rules in the state of Georgia, and if they haven't delegated this specific power, then the agency shouldn't be allowed to change policy. And I would suspect that if this issue is pressed, that is how it will ultimately go. Now, that seems like a grave injustice because this is about the hand counting of ballots, something that is a necessary part of any more legitimate election system that retains any of the features our current election system has. But what if that board made a rule to do away with, for instance, signature matching or expanding the use of ballot drop boxes while limiting their security and monitoring? So that's the bad news part, but it's not all bad news. Let's close this out and we'll talk about how it might be better. John Fervier, the chair of the state election board, echoed the guidance of the Attorney General's office prior to voting on Friday, warning the members that, quote, we'll be going against the advice of our legal counsel by voting in the affirmative, end quote. He also indicated that the board does not have the authority to make such a rule. Such power rests solely with the legislature. This board is an administrative body, not a legislative body, Mr. Fervier said. If the legislature had wanted this, they would have put it in statute. So that's the argument, and I think on principle that argument is correct. And I think if this goes to the courts, it will be overturned. And it isn't going to cost us the election, and it doesn't mean that the country is destroyed. And the good thing is that this actually presents an opportunity to create real change and use a magnificent sifter. All of that can happen if people don't simply celebrate and move on. In Georgia now, the pressure should be put on the legislature. People regularly complain that the Georgia legislature is full of rhinos who do nothing and have done nothing to protect Georgia elections in the last 4 years. Why hasn't the Georgia legislature done this? The pressure should be put on them to implement this policy so that legal challenges to what the state election board decided will immediately become moot. The courts will probably decide against the state election board, and they probably should. The responsibility is with the Georgia legislature. Why can't they get it done? And the answer, of course, which scares people but shouldn't, is that there are too many rhinos. Why? Because of fake elections. They are there because of fake elections. They are going to protect fake elections unless they are not rhinos. And if no pressure is put on them in a situation like this, then we can't find out who the rhinos are. So the process is harder, but it actually yields results, and it gives us critical, necessary information about who's who in Georgia. So it can't just be one red blob. Oh, the red blob is good. The blue blob is bad. No, some of that red blob is also bad, and it's necessary to find out who, which is why you need good sifters. And here's another reason why it's not all bad news. Because if it is decided in the courts that the Georgia State Election Board does not possess the authority to change election rules, then they won't have that power in the future, and it's possible that they never actually had that power in the past. So then you would look at what rules have been changed by the Georgia Election Board in various elections and say, hey, how about that? The Georgia State Election Board did not have the authority to pass those rules. This is an opportunity to get those lines drawn on the field. What we want is for the state legislature to be taking care of these sorts of things, and it will be a benefit for the court to clarify that. So in a narrative sense, it's going to feel like we're taking this one on the chin, but I think it is actually better that way. All right, so let's change gears completely. Donald Trump posted this on Tuesday on Truth Social. He wrote, Howard Lutnick, quote, Donald Trump is here to protect the American worker. Now, Howard Lutnick is the CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald. He is also a supporter of Donald Trump and has been appointed as co-chair of Trump's presidential transition team with Linda McMahon. He's been fundraising for Trump, and he's an economic advisor of Trump. Here he is in a segment on CNBC.
The former president, about tariffs. Do you see it as a bargaining chip, or do you think you're going to see tariffs across the board of 20%?
I think we should put tariffs on stuff we make and not put tariffs on stuff we don't make. It's pretty simple. And of course it's a bargaining chip. We can't sell a Ford or GM in Europe. You go to Europe, you can't sell a Ford or GM. Why? There's 100% tariffs. How about in Japan? 100% tariffs. So do you think if we said, we're going to tariff you the way you tariff us, do you think they're going to allow Mercedes and all these Japanese companies and Porsches and BMWs to all of a sudden have 100% tariffs in America? Of course not. They're going to come and negotiate, and their tariffs are going to come down. And finally, Ford and General Motors are going to be able to sell in these places.
How's that sound, Andrew?
Of course they're going to come down. Of course. This is just negotiating.
It absolutely makes sense. If you do it strategically, if it's across the board, it creates a real problem. And the question is whether you believe the president is going to do it strategically or across the board. He keeps saying it across the board.
Well, when you're running for office, you make broad statements so people understand you.
Right.
Okay? Tariffs are an amazing tool by the president to use. They're an amazing tool, but he understands, don't tariff stuff we don't make. Right? If we don't make it, and you want to buy it, I don't want to put the price up there. It's pointless. But use tariffs to build in America. If we want to make it in America, tariff it, or if we're competing with it, tariff it. But you got to remember, we need to protect the American worker. Finally, someone's going to protect the American worker, and Donald Trump is here to protect the American worker.
Do you think we make a lot of money in tariffs, or if they're used as negotiating tactics? Look, tariffs will come down there. We're not going to have super high tariffs here either. There's not going to be a big pot of money at the end of the day.
I love that story. So which is it? Do we make a lot of money on tariffs, or we bring productivity here, and we drive up our workers here? So it's a win-win scenario. I like both of them. I think what's going to happen is we'll make a bunch of money on the tariffs, but mostly everybody else is going to negotiate with us, and we will be more fair. In 1948, right, we came up with something called the Marshall Plan, right? The world, Germany and Japan were destroyed after World War II, and we wanted to export our economy to them. So we made a rule. They could tariff us, and we won't tariff them. So they can rebuild.
This is the best explanation I've heard of.
So they can rebuild their economy. We rebuilt their economy using something called the Marshall Plan. Yeah. Our economy is so awesome that we'll use it to help you rebuild. When should that have ended? What do you think, 1980? Right? 1985? I mean, why 40 years are Japan and Germany and all of Europe still tariffing the heck out of our auto industry, tariffing the heck out of our furniture industry? Do you realize all your furniture you're buying that's made foreign? It seems crazy. Why? It's because they tariff us and we don't tariff them. It's so obvious.
Now, what he said there at the end is so interesting. It's so obvious. Yeah, of course it's so obvious if you have the proper goals in mind. If you actually want the United States of America to do well, then it's so obvious. Other countries do it. It works just fine for them. They do it to us, and that's still fine. But if we do it outwardly, then free trade is no longer a thing. At least that's the appeal that neocons and establishment conservatives make to MAGA. They treat it the same way the uniparty left treats racism. It's just an umbrella term for something that is really, really terrible. And they're racist sometimes, but when they're racist, when they're employing the good kind of racism, well, then it's not racism. The uniparty right does this with free trade. It's an umbrella term. Free trade is good no matter what, but also they get to define what constitutes free trade and what violates free trade. The country doesn't have a responsibility to uphold whatever their current definition of quote unquote free trade is. The country's responsibility is to look out for the country and its citizens. And when you're doing that, the solution is obvious. But when that is not your goal, then the obvious solution is the one thing you must avoid, because there are different goals. The goal is globalism. Rather than each individual country being self-sufficient and looking out for its own interests to the extent that it can, purchasing from abroad when necessary, maintaining good relationships with the countries from whom we need things, which is its own strategy toward world peace. But rather than that, everything is fragmented around the world according to a plan, and then resources, productions, and profits are also distributed in line with that same plan. Countries conducting their own trade policy for their own benefit is not at all obvious if you are attempting to create a one-world international liberal rules-based order. And that, my friends, is a total inversion within the false reality. The most obvious thing to do to protect the country is the one thing that must be avoided. Now, I have to share this story with you because you know how much I enjoy the narrative about what's happening in Venezuela surrounding the re-election of Nicolas Maduro. This is from Politico's European branch yesterday. European Parliament recognizes Venezuela's exiled candidate as real president. It is amazing. The European Parliament on Thursday recognized Venezuela's exiled presidential candidate Edmundo Gonzalez as the country's legitimate and democratically elected president. And of course, they are doing this upon no evidence. It is a baseless claim by the European Parliament that Edmundo Gonzalez is the president of Venezuela. Why is another country or a group of countries a union of European states, if you will, attempting to declare for the world who the president of Venezuela is. Isn't that insane? But it turns out that's exactly how it works. That's how it works everywhere. Joe Biden is recognized as quote-unquote president by some countries in Europe and some members of the British Commonwealth, and maybe the occasional regime proxy state here and there. But that's it. He didn't win an election. He's just recognized as president by the global regime. It means nothing in the case of Venezuela. It doesn't really mean anything here either. Edmundo Gonzalez can go have meetings with Tony Blinken. He can go conduct foreign policy with Condoleezza Rice. Doesn't matter at all. So why does it matter that Joe Biden does it? But let's continue. The joint resolution was backed by the center-right European People's Party, the hard-right European Conservatives and Reformists, and the far-right Patriots for Europe, marking the first time since the June EU election that conservatives from across the right have united to pass a vote. The resolution, which was adopted by a vote of 309 to 201 with 12 abstentions, is symbolic and holds no legal validity. Gosh, how about that? In the resolution, members of parliament condemned the arrest warrant the Venezuelan government had issued against Gonzalez, along with the killings, harassment, and human rights abuses that have been directed against the democratic opposition and civil society, calling for an end to such quote-unquote systematic violations. Gonzalez left Venezuela and flew to Spain September 8th after Madrid granted him asylum. Members of parliament also noted that reports from international election observers, quote-unquote, clearly indicate that the July 28th Venezuelan presidential election failed to meet international standards for election integrity. Tensions escalated Sunday after the Venezuelan government arrested 3 U.S. nationals and 2 EU citizens, accusing them of participating in a U.S.-led plot to kill Maduro and several members of his government. The EU's Foreign Affairs Chief Josep Borrell termed Maduro's government dictatorial and authoritarian during an interview with a Spanish television channel Sunday. So the Venezuelans arrested a group of people from the U.S. and Europe who were intending to kill Nicolas Maduro, and now they're mad about it. It's interesting, isn't it, that we're hearing about the same issues playing out in our country too? How does it happen? What an unbelievable series of coincidences we've seen. Why isn't Politico noting that these are baseless claims and that Venezuelan election authorities disagree with these claims? That there is actually no evidence supporting these claims. Why can't Politico tell us that so that we know the members of the European Parliament are full of shit? I guess we'll just have to thank them for letting us know that everything the members of Parliament did is meaningless. Let's continue with this from Bloomberg on Wednesday. Trump says he will meet with India's Modi next week. Former President Donald Trump said Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi plans to meet with him next week, the latest visit from a foreign leader or official as nations grapple with the possibility of the Republican returning to power after November's election. He happens to be coming to meet me next week, and Modi, he's fantastic, Trump said Tuesday during a town hall in Flint, Michigan, as he revealed the visit during a winding answer that touched on free trade and protecting U.S. jobs. The Trump campaign did not immediately respond to a request seeking details about the meeting. Modi will be in the U.S. this weekend, where he is slated to attend the Quad Leaders Summit in Wilmington, Delaware, and is being hosted by President Joe Biden. On September 23rd, Modi is expected to address the Summit of the Future at the United Nations General Assembly in New York. Trump has met with other world leaders this year, including Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who visited the former president at his Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida in March, and with Polish President Andrzej Duda at the Trump Tower in New York. They fail to mention how Benjamin Netanyahu flew all the way down to Trump's house to go meet with him, and how Trump took a picture where he put his hand right over their handshake, signifying Trump has the upper hand. I had Perplexity AI list for me other world leaders who have visited Donald Trump in the last 2 years. And it notes that leaders from Japan and Argentina, as well as Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, have come to meet with Donald Trump. But just like Bloomberg, they totally ignore the fact that Netanyahu flew to meet with Donald Trump. It's like they don't really want people to know about that. Let's continue. As President Trump traveled to India in 2020, a trip which saw Modi roll out the red carpet to court the Republican, who is fond of large crowd sizes, including an event at a cricket stadium where he was greeted by more than 100,000 people. Ah, yes, it's all about Trump's ego and not the fact that one of the most powerful leaders in the world gave Donald Trump the red carpet treatment in 2020. Under Biden, according to Bloomberg, the U.S. has pledged to work with India on technology such as artificial intelligence and committed to the co-production of sensitive defense technologies. Biden has sought to strengthen ties with Asian nations to better counter China's growing military and economic influence in the Asia-Pacific region. The president also hosted Modi for a state dinner in 2023. But U.S.-India ties under Biden have also been frustrated in part by New Delhi's reluctance to broker an end to Russia's war on Ukraine. India is reliant on Russia for military weapons and cheap oil and has refrained from condemning Vladimir Putin for his invasion. Modi visited Kyiv in August for the first time since the war began and has advocated for diplomacy and dialogue to end the conflict. So about a month ago, Modi went and visited the comedic actor in Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, and they restarted a 2012 defense pact. And the day after, India's defense minister was in the United States, where he met with his Pentagon counterpart, which is currently Lloyd Austin, to agree to a defense partnership. So India has defense partnerships with Russia, Ukraine, and the United States. That's weird, isn't it? Since Russia is at war with Ukraine and we support Ukraine, we basically are the war on Ukraine's side, at least insofar as we represent the global regime. And India, under Narendra Modi, who was named by Vladimir Putin to the Order of St. Andrew in Russia, just confirmed their own defense partnership. So I guess India's just on everybody's side? Now, that doesn't make any sense within the central narrative, but outside the central narrative, it makes perfect sense. But Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is not the only foreign leader Trump plans to meet with next week. He's also going to meet with the comedic actor from Ukraine. This is an outlet out of Asia called The Straits Times. Ukraine's Zelensky, to meet Biden and Harris, plans to see Trump. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will meet U.S. President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris next week and plans to see former President Donald Trump as he visits the U.S. to shore up support before November's crucial presidential election. Mr. Zelensky will be covering all the political bases in what could be his last such visit before an election that could upend Washington's policy of support for Ukraine against Russia's invasion. The White House said Mr. Zelensky will have separate talks on September 26th with Biden and Harris. And of course, separate meetings give the opportunity for Kamala Harris to have a photo shoot with Volodymyr Zelensky, making her look somehow, quote unquote, presidential. There is no other reason for that. The comedic actor in Ukraine is not going to be having a real meeting about policy with the cackling idiot Kamala Harris. It's preposterous. Mr. Zelensky has said he will share a victory plan with the U.S. leaders to end the war in Russia. In a statement, Karine Jean-Pierre said, "The president and vice president will emphasize their unshakable commitment to stand with Ukraine until it prevails in this war." Mr. Biden said separately that he was, quote, "looking forward to hosting my friend, President Zelensky." He added during his visit, "I'll reaffirm America's commitment to supporting Ukraine as it defends its freedom and independence." The Ukrainian presidency said separately that Mr. Zelensky plans to meet, quote, "the 45th president of the United States, Donald Trump." It's weird that they didn't say former president. The article notes that there was no immediate confirmation from Trump's camp, but Trump has said he will probably meet with Zelensky next week. And just another note from the article, Mr. Zelensky has, meanwhile, been pressuring the Biden administration to let it fire Western-made long-range weapons into Russian territory. Mr. Biden and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer put off a decision on the issue last week, with Mr. Starmer saying they would discuss it further when they meet at the UN General Assembly in New York next week. The Ukrainian leader said last week that he planned to discuss his victory plan with Mr. Biden this month and added on September 18th that the plan was now fully prepared. And that meeting between Biden and Starmer didn't go that well, because it turns out that Joe doesn't have the ability to do what is being asked by the global regime counterparts. He's not able to let Ukraine fire long-range weapons into Russia. My pal Ghost of Base Patrick Henry pays a lot of attention to history and a lot of attention to geopolitical affairs. He was listening to an appearance by Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson on Judge Napolitano's podcast and clipped something very interesting. This is what he posted earlier today on X, formerly Twitter. Ghost writes, take a listen to what retired Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson told Judge Andrew Napolitano yesterday. A combatant commander has effectively usurped the White House, State Department, and CIA and has taken control of U.S. diplomacy in the Middle East, telling Netanyahu that if he invades Lebanon or anywhere else, he's on his own. How could a single combatant commander possess the authority to do something like this? And then he recommends his readers go to devolution.link and read about devolution as outlined by my good friend John Harold, Patel Patriot. Let's take a listen to Colonel Wilkerson.
I think what we're seeing here is another attempt, because the 100-plane strike didn't do it, by Netanyahu to provoke Hezbollah to some sort of action that he can then declare is warlike to the extent that he can do what he wants to do with them. Even though I'm told with great confidence in the source says that the latest two visits by the Central Command Unified Commander were to tell him that we would not be with him in the event of his going to war with Hezbollah that he provoked, nor would we be with him going to war with Iran that he provoked. And we made it quite clear that we would know if he provoked it. So I have to declare
you're speaking of General Kurilla.
Yes.
So Scott Ritter agrees with you. Doug McGregor says he can't imagine Austin and Blinken letting General Kurilla do that. It's very, very interesting. Is this, forgive me, Colonel, is this speculation on your part, or is it based on sources?
Promotion accepted.
I want to be there for it.
It's based on some pretty reliable sources. And here's the bigger picture. And I hope the others told you this too. Biden's fury, and you could see it. He was seething when he met with the British Prime Minister.
Yes, we have that clip. He was out of control with anger.
And what he'd just been told, apparently, was by the Pentagon, no dice, Mr. President. No dice on Ukraine and no dice on Gaza.
Now,
we're in charge now.
No dice, you're talking about no dice on the long-range missiles reaching deep into Russia, even though Tony Blinken had intimated all week in Kyiv with his British counterpart that this was happening. And Sir Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, had every reason to believe as he's flying across the Atlantic that Joe Biden's answer would be yes.
He was embarrassed. He was embarrassed by the fact he was pulling out his maps with target data. And Biden told him, don't even pull them out. We're not going to talk about that. I've been told, again, by fairly reliable sources, that Blinken and Sullivan, Blinken primarily, but Sullivan too, have been sidetracked. And what's happened is the Pentagon has taken over essentially diplomacy as well as any action, militarily speaking, with regard to both theaters of war. And so they're now in charge. And I have to change my evaluation of Secretary Austin if that's the case, because it means he listened finally to the people in the bowels of the Pentagon who know the truth, and he's reacting to that, and he's told the President Biden that, and to Biden's credit, even though he was furious, he finally took that advice.
Colonel, you once ran the State Department. How does the Defense Department engage in diplomacy?
They engage in diplomacy every day. They're 4 stars in the various sanctums, the regions that they control, the AORs. are the true U.S. diplomats. And some of them are very good at it. I saw some of them. I worked with some of them who are very good at it, better than any Secretary of State. But it shouldn't be that way. That's a parenthetical remark. We shouldn't have the military leading diplomacy, but we often do. And the Japanese Prime Minister once told me why, to my face. He said, Larry, when your East Asia and Pacific Assistant Secretary comes out here, he's not got anything but his briefcase. When the man from Honolulu comes out here, from Camp Smith in Hawaii, comes out here, he's towing air wings, submarines, battle groups, marine amphibious groups, army divisions. I listened to him. This is the Prime Minister of Japan.
Who told General Kurilla to tell Prime Minister Netanyahu, if you invade Lebanon, you're on your own?
It was, I think, Austin. That's the chain of command. Austin conveyed that message to him, but I think it was Austin that convinced Biden to give him that command so he could transmit it to Cirillo.
So Colonel Wilkerson's best estimation, and no disrespect to Colonel Wilkerson, he was the former chief of staff to Colin Powell when he was Secretary of State. But he sounds like he's guessing on that last part, the assumption being either that Lloyd Austin somehow usurped the fake president's authority or convinced the fake president to give him the authority to prevent long-range missiles from going into Russia and to prevent Israel from further expanding their quote-unquote war. Now, within the central narrative, all you can do is guess. But outside the central narrative, if you consider devolution, if you've been paying attention to my podcast and to Badlands over the last few years, this tracks perfectly with everything we've been saying. Joe Biden does not function as commander-in-chief. There is no reason to believe that Joe Biden ever has functioned as commander-in-chief. And as they mentioned, the fake president was none too happy in that meeting with Starmer because the world had been told that Biden would approve of these long-range missiles. And then it turned out he just couldn't. Whoops, I guess. It's crazy how things that are impossible to understand within the central narrative become pretty obvious outside of it. Now, last week, we briefly touched on an article from Politico about how the global regime was considering dumping Volodymyr Zelensky. There had been changes made in his quote-unquote cabinet that just didn't happen to be enough for their tastes. The Politico headline was, Zelensky's power grab is bad for Ukraine. 2 years ago, they were saying that Zelensky was Churchill. He was one of the greatest leaders of all time. Not that Churchill actually is, but that is how the story goes. Zelensky was on that level. He was going to save Europe from a full invasion by the brutal authoritarian dictator. Oh, what a hero he is. Now it's a power grab and Zelensky is the bad guy. Now, when thinking about Ukraine, it is important to remember that the comedic actor was the one who gave Donald Trump the transcript of the so-called quid pro quo phone call that was the basis for the Trump-Ukraine impeachment hoax. Adam Schiff read out a version of that phone call and then got trumped by the actual transcripts of the call via the comedic actor in Ukraine. Well, this week we have another headline along the same lines in Politico. Does America want Ukraine to defeat Russia? It doesn't look that way. And you'll remember that same framing from the debate. Donald Trump was asked if he wants Ukraine to defeat Russia, and he said, I want the dying to stop. From Politico. Once again, Ukrainian wartime leaders are preoccupied with a looming choice across the ocean in Washington that will shape their fate as much as anything that happens on the front lines. In my conversations with them here in recent days, they expressed a mix of concern, exhaustion, and determination. The spring and summer fighting seasons brought successes, a stunning incursion into Russia, and technological advances in drone and robotic warfare that blunted their enemies' advantages in weapons and manpower. This is so silly. But the human cost for Ukraine is huge. Pictures of those killed in action hang across Kyiv. Russia is stepping up bombing attacks, including on this capital and energy infrastructure, with worries growing that this winter may be the hardest ever. All that puts a great weight of expectations on Washington. In the coming weeks, President Joe Biden must decide whether to allow the Ukrainian military to use the U.S.-provided long-range missiles to strike deeper into Russia. This is just the latest in a series of decisions about the extent of American support for Ukraine. But it is also potentially a pivot in America's approach to this conflict. The Ukrainians are asking the American president, well, not really, to expand the target list to include sites beyond the immediate border area in Russia that America has allowed them to strike. It is a fair ask. Russians are waging war on Ukraine from their territory, sending bombers and missiles, and Kyiv wants to use the weapons it has to defend itself. Except the weapons it has are from us, and the intelligence it has is from us, and the funding it has is from us. This writer is basically saying, World War III, it's only fair. He writes, is this escalation? No more so than when Ukraine asked for advanced American Abrams tanks, F-16s, or the surface-to-surface Army tactical missile systems from the U.S. It's more about giving the Ukrainians the ability to wage war as well as they can with the weapons they have. As the Russian leader has done every time the U.S. was considering these requests, Vladimir Putin made threatening noises, warning last week that Ukrainian attack-'em strikes on Russia will mean that NATO countries, the United States and European countries, are at war with Russia. And of course that's what it means. Every other time, nothing changed when Biden, almost always after protracted stewing, signed off on one or another allegedly escalatory step. Yeah, that's because none of them actually went into place on any timeline that mattered. They've been running the same narrative for over 2.5 years, and the longer they run it, the sillier it gets. On the live stream the other day, we went through the op-ed in The Hill written by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Donald Trump Jr., where they said about this issue, if you poke the bear 5 times, you shouldn't just assume it'll still be safe to poke the bear again even harder. The article is rather long, so I'm going to skip down toward the end. The Biden administration's fear of escalation used to center around Russia's nuclear arsenal. Though former President Donald Trump mentioned Putin's nukes at the presidential debate last Tuesday, that's not as big a concern now. Russia's patron, China, told Putin to keep that saber unrattled. Putin also knows that kind of escalation could well be his own end. This writer is a sociopath. He also seems like he may be severely retarded. His name is Matthew Kaminsky. He is asserting that somehow China controls Russia and therefore nothing's going to happen. Also, Putin choosing to escalate would not be his own end. It's so weird that these people think we can escalate and they're just going to have to take it. They're not allowed to escalate any further. It's like they haven't thought their way out of the fact that the one world international liberal rules-based order doesn't exist anymore. These days, the fear is that Russia can cause America a lot of pain in the Middle East by arming foes like the Houthis to strike U.S. troops and interests. Well, what exactly stopped them from doing that now? In the wake of its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Russia has claimed to be at war not with Ukraine, which to the Kremlin is not even a legitimate nation, but with the entire West. And of course, that is exactly right. It's weird that our foreign policy experts have no idea what the world is. Ukraine is not a legitimate nation. It's never been a legitimate nation. It is just recognized as such by the same sorts of people who just declared meaninglessly that Nicolas Maduro's not president of Venezuela. They can say that, and other people can allow it to continue because it's not worth objecting, but at no time does it make it really real. And wait, what if Ukraine's not the only country like that? A senior Ukrainian official granted anonymity added, "We have crossed all these red lines and the Russians are weaker than ever." You can discount for some spin about Russian weakness without diluting the point that the ramping up of military support, despite Putin's bluster, has enabled Ukraine to significantly diminish the Russian military in ways that benefit American and European security interests. Oh, yes, Russia is weaker than ever. The worrying battlefield outlook gives the push urgency. Ukraine last month took the Kremlin by surprise to occupy 400 square miles of Russian territory near Kursk, and with drones smashed up a third of Russia's Black Sea fleet. But the Ukrainians are ceding ground in the eastern Donbass region and fighting off massive drone and missile attacks in their largest cities. They need a morale and momentum shift. Lowering the restrictions on missile use could help. Skipping down to the end. What the U.S. does in Ukraine reverberates around the world. Allies and foes are watching closely. The Biden record on supporting its friend is mixed. As if they haven't already done way too much. Less than a year into his term, he pulled the U.S. out of Afghanistan, leaving behind some tens of thousands of Afghans who worked for the Americans, $300 billion in U.S. military kit, a bilateral security treaty in tatters, and American standing and deterrence weakened. Whatever you think about the merits of the war there, America abandoned its allies in Afghanistan, and Biden's presidency never recovered. The downward turn in his approval ratings dates back to September of 2021. But here's the thing from this terribly stupid perspective. Afghanistan went from being the world's #1 producer in opium to having the opium industry banned last year by the Taliban. So Afghanistan used to be the biggest producer of opium in the world, and now they no longer produce opium. But Afghanistan's opium, we were always told, went only to the black market, whereas the opium from Turkey and India and Australia went to Big Pharma as an input into its opiates. Big Pharma simply repackages the same street drugs and sells them to people in different versions. Then at some point in the very recent history, both of these things happened. The U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan, and fentanyl overtook all the poppy-based opiates as the drug that was killing so many American young people. So after all that Afghan opium hit the black market, where did it go from there? And who made all those black market profits? Was it the people who were controlling Afghanistan, aka our military-industrial complex and the CIA? Was it all of those quote-unquote friends we helped escape the country? But wait, there's more. Turkey, India, and Australia are the biggest producers of opium for pharma, but the #1 opium-producing country now, or at least as of last year, is Myanmar. And the regime just got kicked out of there not too long ago. They're trying to make inroads again. Amazing how that happens, isn't it? It's almost like the entire Afghan occupation was all about keeping that opium trade going for pharma while they killed strong young people in countries all over the world, I'm sure, but certainly in America, under the guise of defeating terrorism in the person of the Taliban, who are the people that ended the opium trade and thus all of that money flow. And on what basis were they able to go occupy Afghanistan for 2 decades? Well, Osama bin Laden totally did 9/11. These people are insane. The Ukrainians and their friends are dropping loud hints that Biden has a chance to reshape his legacy in his last 4 months. Put the caution aside and put the U.S. firmly behind victory for Ukraine by giving them all the tools they need to win, not merely to not lose. Or as they say fatalistically here in the 3rd year of a war of attrition, die a slow death. If not, Biden will have Chicken Kiev sequel to finish out his presidency. His choice. And honestly, I hope that is a preview. I hope the regime and its global media decide to make Biden look bad for not being militaristic enough in Ukraine. It really is incredible once you can start seeing through it. They're going to use propaganda media to attack the fake president, Joe Biden, as the one who lost the quote-unquote war in Ukraine. This is from TASS. This is the Russian news agency. So this is Russian state media, but I appreciate how they actually admit to it. It's too bad Politico doesn't admit to being global regime state media, CIA media. All outlets are biased. All journalists are biased. All podcasters are biased. Everybody is biased. The point is to attempt to admit and account for those biases rather than pretending to be objective, which is the first lie the objective journalists tell. Zelensky may be overthrown if Ukraine fails to hold elections. This from a Ukrainian member of parliament. A coup may take place in Ukraine if the country's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, remains in office and the authorities fail to hold elections, opposition lawmaker of Verkhovna Rada, Alexander Dubinsky, said, and the Verkhovna Rada is the Ukrainian parliament. A coup is possible if Zelensky, who has done everything contrary to the interests of Ukraine, remains in power, bypassing the elections. Surely no one will tolerate this, he wrote on his Telegram channel. Zelensky's presidential powers officially expired after May 20th. Ukraine is still facing the question of the legitimacy of power in the absence of parliamentary and presidential elections, which cannot be held during martial law. The concern of Kyiv's Western partners about this fact was recognized by the former Ukrainian ambassador to the UK, Vadim Pristaiko. Russian President Vladimir Putin noted that Ukraine was now glossing over its own constitutional court's May 2014 ruling that the presidential term cannot be extended. As Putin said, this means that Zelensky's presidential term had, quote, expired together with its legitimacy, which cannot be restored by any tricks. Man, it's starting to seem like the global regime might lose one of its proxy states altogether. In fact, maybe its most important proxy state, because, of course, Ukraine, that land, that ground, is the ancestral seat of the Khazarian mafia. And that fact is probably why Vladimir Putin spent so long on the history of that region in his interview with Tucker Carlson. Ukraine was their perfect hub for corruption and money laundering, human trafficking, drug trafficking, weapons trafficking. They had their biolabs, and they were trying to join NATO, while not even being recognized as a country by their very powerful neighbors next door. The regime had been implementing and overthrowing Ukraine for decades, and it seems that time may now be coming to an end. Ukraine was meant to be their second Israel, and that is a deep rabbit hole all of its own, but it doesn't look like that's going to work out for them. Will they keep trying for 50 years as they did to establish Israel in Palestine? Maybe. Good luck, commies. It seems like the plan is to create the conditions for new elections in Ukraine and then steal those elections and declare that someone else is the new president of Ukraine and just keep going. But it doesn't seem like that's going to work out either. Now, Wilkerson mentioned Ukraine, which is the second Israel, but he also mentioned Israel, which is, Israel is the second Israel. There was the original Israel. Now there's the global regime proxy state of Israel. And then after that, I guess Ukraine would be the third Israel. So Wilkerson mentioned the second and third Israel. But let's focus now on the global regime proxy state currently known as Israel. This is CNN from Wednesday. Israel notified U.S. ahead of Tuesday's Lebanon operation, but gave no details of what was planned, sources say. Israeli officials notified the U.S. that the country was going to carry out an operation in Lebanon on Tuesday, but did not give any details about what they were planning, according to three sources familiar with the matter, including in a call between Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant early Tuesday morning. The fact no details about the operation were given meant U.S. officials were in the dark until reports of hundreds of exploding pagers emerged a short time later, the sources said. CNN has learned that Israel was behind the audacious attack, which has heightened tensions in a region already on edge even further, and it was a joint operation between Israel's intelligence service, the Mossad, and the Israeli military. The Lebanese government condemned the attack as, quote, criminal Israeli aggression. At least 20 people were killed and more than 450 were injured, according to health officials in Lebanon, on Wednesday after walkie-talkies detonated in a fresh wave of explosions one day after the pager blasts killed at least 12 people. Now, I'm guessing most of you have probably heard about this story, but these various mobile devices reportedly exploded in people's hands or otherwise on their person, killing and injuring all of these people. Now, there are two theories about that. One of them is that there was some sort of electronic signal sent or interference with the device that made the device, a normal device, explode. But it's also been reported that various Israeli actors actually implanted explosives into these devices, and that seems more likely. And I think it's probably necessary to understand that this is an act of terrorism. To the extent this is true, this is state-sponsored terrorism coming out of Israel. Tuesday's explosions came as Secretary of State Antony Blinken was traveling from Washington to Cairo, stunning U.S. diplomats who watched the breaking news in real time on their airplane TVs. And how about that? The Secretary of State under the real president, Joe Biden, the man responsible for conducting foreign affairs on behalf of the United States, a man who has been working in global foreign affairs for a very long time, had no idea what his closest allies in Israel were about to do. Now, is that true? It's impossible to know, but that's quite a narrative whether or not it is true. It wasn't the first time that Israel has taken provocative action around the same time Blinken was on a visit to the Middle East. But this specific action triggered concerns about regional escalation that the U.S. has long been trying to avoid. Blinken said the U.S., quote, did not know about, nor was it involved in these incidents, end quote. And again, that's what they're going to say because they don't want to take any responsibility. It's like how rogue Ukrainian actors were blamed for the Nord Stream pipeline narrative and the Crimean Bridge and the assassination of Alexander Dugin's daughter. Naturally, the U.S. State Department is going to wash its hands of that. The U.S. conveyed to Iran via a back channel that they were not involved in the attack and Iran should not escalate, a separate U.S. official told CNN. Iran's ambassador to Lebanon was injured by the exploding pagers, according to Iranian state media. Wow. So the Iranian ambassador to Lebanon was almost killed in this terrorist incident? What would happen if that would have happened? Well, that very likely would have been seen as an act of war by Iran. That's the sort of thing that could lead to a much larger conflict in the Middle East. And of course, as with Ukraine and Europe, the regime embodied in the United States and factions within Israel have wanted a much broader conflict in the Middle East. War is the business. War is the only chance they have to regain control. War is the mechanism by which they make nations comply if the propaganda doesn't work and the finance doesn't work. And now we are clearly being shown that they can't make the war thing work either. But they have to keep the world believing that they can, so they have these sorts of incidents and then talk about threat of escalation. Galantan Austin spoke a second time later Tuesday after it became clear thousands of Hezbollah members were wounded by exploding pagers. But officials declined to go into what was discussed. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre said Tuesday that, quote, the U.S. was not involved and was, quote, not aware of this incident that hundreds of pagers were going to explode in Lebanon ahead of time. Jean-Pierre's wording was precise in that the U.S. was not told specifically about exploding pagers in advance. The notification from Israel was far more generic and vague, leaving U.S. officials with questions about what the operation could be, the sources said. Again, the fake and illegitimate administration is totally out of the loop. Now, it's possible that they are okay with the public believing that because they believe that it doesn't place the responsibility on them. But as we've discussed many times over these past few years, it doesn't seem like the fake and illegitimate president and his administration have any better information than we do. All of our information is open source. They are making things up and hoping to propagandize the world into believing them. It's not knowledge in the first place. They're reporting about the stage show they're producing. It would be like watching a movie where at the end of every scene, the movie just stopped and a narrator came to tell you his own version of what you just saw, and then the movie keeps playing. CNN updated this storyline yesterday with this headline: New era of war beginning, Israel says, as more Hezbollah devices explode across Lebanon. They first run through the same backstory, updating the numbers of injured to more than 2,800 before quoting Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. We are at the beginning of a new era in this war, and we need to adapt ourselves, he said. He praised the quote-unquote excellent achievements of the IDF, together with the country's security agency, the Shin Bet, and its intelligence agency, Mossad. CNN previously reported that Tuesday's operation was a joint effort between the IDF and Mossad, but Gallant's comment is the first time an Israeli official has apparently acknowledged Israel's role in the twin attacks. An Israeli source familiar with national security later told CNN Israel launched the pager attack in a use it or lose it moment when it believed Hezbollah discovered the capability. The pager explosions came hours after Israel on Monday voted to add another war objective to its conflict with Iran-backed Hamas and Hezbollah, ensuring the safe return of residents from communities along its border with Lebanon to their homes. So, man, I guess that ceasefire deal that Kamala kept screaming she was about to achieve isn't coming together so quickly. And, of course, we discussed that last week in the debate coverage. This narrative operation will prove that they are feckless. They have no say in the matter. Kamala Harris cannot achieve a ceasefire. Neither can Joe Biden, because neither of them wield any actual power. Skipping down toward the end. Speculation is mounted over how low-tech wireless communication devices could have been exploited, as well as the origins of those devices and a mysterious supply chain stretching from Taiwan to Hungary. The New York Times reported Tuesday that Israel hid explosives inside a batch of pagers ordered from Taiwanese manufacturer Gold Apollo and destined for Hezbollah. A switch was embedded to detonate them remotely, it added. But Gold Apollo denied making the pagers bearing its brand name and pointed to a Budapest-registered distributor as the manufacturer. Hungarian authorities denied Gold Apollo's suggestion, saying that BAC Consulting is a trading intermediary with no manufacturing sites in the country. So it sounds like this doesn't actually involve Hungary, even though it is framed as involving Hungary. It sounds like it only involves Taiwan. So it kind of sounds like maybe these were produced with the explosives inside in Taiwan, one of those global regime proxy states. This is certainly not the part people are talking about now, but it's something to keep our eyes open for in the future. The twin attacks in Lebanon risk further escalating tensions in the region, already heightened over Israel's war against Palestinian militant group Hamas in Gaza. UN Security General Antonio Guterres has urged parties to avert any further escalation. The UN chief said the logic of making all the devices explode was that of, quote, a preemptive strike before a major military operation. But of course, that wasn't what it was. The Secretary General of the UN is trying to pretend that that was a legitimate act of war when instead it is only an act of state-sponsored terrorism. Lebanon's foreign minister, Abdullah Boob Habib, told CNN he fears the consecutive attacks signal a move to an introduction to war. It's a scary moment, and we are afraid of it coming to war because we don't want a war, said the foreign minister, calling on the UN Security Council and the United States to help reestablish peace along the Lebanon-Israel border. The Associated Press ran articles that were widely redistributed by other outlets on Wednesday, asking whether Israel was preparing for a war with Hezbollah. And then we have this today from Reuters: Israel kills top Hezbollah figure in Beirut strike. Israel killed a top Hezbollah commander and other senior figures in the Lebanese movement in an airstrike on Beirut on Friday, vowing to press on with a new military campaign until it is able to secure the area around the Lebanese border. The Israeli military and a security source in Lebanon said Ibrahim Akil had been killed with other senior members of an elite Hezbollah unit in the airstrike, sharply escalating the year-long conflict between Israel and the Iran-backed group. Hezbollah confirmed Akil's death in a statement just after midnight that called him one of its top leaders, without providing details of how he died. Lebanon's health ministry said at least 14 people died in the strike, and the toll was expected to climb as rescue teams worked throughout the night. It was not immediately known whether the toll included Akil and other Hezbollah commanders. Earlier, the ministry said that at least 66 people were injured, 9 of whom were in critical condition. A second security source said at least 6 other Hezbollah commanders died when multiple missiles slammed into the opening of a building's garage. The explosion tore into the building's lower levels as Akil met with other commanders inside. In a brief statement carried by the Israeli media, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Israel's goals were clear and its actions spoke for themselves. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, who said this week that Israel is launching a new phase of war on the northern border, posted on X, formerly Twitter, the sequence of actions in the new phase will continue until our goal is achieved, the safe return of the residents of the north to their homes. See that? It's just like with the hostages. Now war can go on forever. We need to war until there's peace. And still, all of this is justified by 2 things and 2 things only. The paragliding go-kart incident, that one day when paragliding go-karts were able to fly over the most secured border in the history of the world, even though the people protecting that border had advanced knowledge of the attack and the fact that people in the West, through the implementation of the Schofield Bible, have been convinced that the global proxy state of Israel is the exact same thing as biblical Israel, and therefore all good Christians must defer to whatever Israel says forever. It is a mad world, my friends. We need some sanity here. And we will wrap up the week with the new story about Iran. This is from yesterday in ABC News. Harris campaign says it did not use Trump campaign materials sent from Iranian hackers. Kamala Harris's campaign said on Thursday that it did not use any materials that the FBI said Iranian hackers gathered from email accounts associated with former President Donald Trump's campaign and sent to President Joe Biden's campaign before he left the race. Trump's campaign on Wednesday demanded more information from Harris's campaign, including that it disclose the materials it received and whether it was used. A Harris campaign official told ABC News that the materials were not used. The campaign declined to comment on whether or not they would comply with the Trump campaign's request to disclose what they received. Over the summer, Iranian hackers sent unsolicited emails to individuals associated with then-candidate Biden that contained an excerpt taken from stolen, non-public material from former President Trump's campaign as text in the emails, according to information released by the FBI and other U.S. intelligence agencies on Wednesday. The contents of those excerpts are not yet clear. The FBI said there was no information indicating that the recipients of the information replied to the hackers' messages. The White House said Biden only learned Wednesday about the Iranian hackers sending what the FBI called stolen information from the Trump campaign to individuals associated with his campaign. Trump's campaign said that hackers are interfering to help Harris and Biden because, quote, they know President Trump will restore his tough sanctions and stand against their reign of terror, end quote. Iran's mission to the United Nations called the intelligence agency's findings fundamentally unfounded and wholly inadmissible. And by the way, it is entirely possible that this is fake news that nonetheless makes Donald Trump look good. It may be that someone sent something to Biden and Harris, but that doesn't mean that it's quote unquote Iran. And in the good twin, evil twin paradigm, it's not even really relevant. We were told Iran was trying to assassinate Trump. And we were told about 5 weeks ago by NBC News that the Trump campaign office in Virginia was burglarized after it had been hacked by Iranian hackers in June. So we are essentially talking about the same incident, but we're supposed to only understand that this was Iranian hackers, and it definitely wasn't that burglary around the same time. My friend John Harold, who I mentioned earlier, posted this on X, formerly Twitter, and Telegram and elsewhere. 2023, Biden administration unfreezes $6 billion for Iran. 2024, Iran hacks Trump campaign and sends the hacked material to Biden-Harris. Did Quid Pro Joe and Co. do it again? And he links headlines from the Associated Press in both instances. This is the narrative that will develop. And we're going to see this narrative develop whether or not the details of the underlying story as currently described are true. And why are we going to see that? Because that's what the narrative calls for. We're getting the reverse 2016 story when it comes to these campaign machinations. Here is Donald Trump yesterday on Truth Social. Wow, just out. The FBI caught Iran spying on my campaign and giving all of the information to the Kamala Harris campaign. Therefore, she and her campaign were illegally spying on me, to be known as the Iran case. Will Kamala resign in disgrace from politics? Will the communist left pick a new candidate to replace her? And hey, maybe they will. We'll see how this goes. Wouldn't it be great to see them swap Kamala out and throw Big Mike in there? The country's realized that Kamala ain't going to make it. They've got to figure out some reason for a change. Maybe they'll start delving into Kamala Harris's real past. Let's get a little more from Trump on this. This is from an interview he did with Newsmax.
Iran, just like Russia. We had to put up with that for 2.5 years. And after 2.5 years, I could have told them the first hour. But after 2.5 years, and they know it was a hoax, but this isn't a hoax. This is real. I mean, this is real stuff. They hacked my campaign. They spied on my campaign, and they gave the information to Kamala. So when is the grand jury meeting? I'd like to know. Is there going to be a grand jury? We went through 2.5 years on a hoax. This is not a hoax. This was found by the FBI. I congratulate them for that. But this is not a hoax. They spied on my campaign, and they gave the information to the Harris campaign.
Yeah, well, they're not the first people to spy on your campaign, too. You've had issues
we had
with that.
Obama and Biden spy on my campaign, too. Let's see what happens with that.
Yeah.
So Trump says, this is real stuff. Obama and Biden, they spied on my campaign, too. Let's see what happens with that. Yes, indeed. Let's see. Maybe then the country will finally snap out of it. Because inside the central narrative, none of this makes sense. But outside, it's obvious. I'll be back on Monday at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic. And Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening for free and would like to support the show, the best way to do that is by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can find the info stream over on Telegram at t.me/veryreasonable. The merch site is cancelcouture.com. And for all my other links, you can visit linktree.com/imyourmoderator. And I'll see you soon. Down on the range.